Good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's a tremendous pleasure to welcome you to this evening's panel presentation, Russia Now, the Current State of the Former Soviet Union. My name is Tom Hodge, and I have the honor of being the chair of the Russian department here at Wellesley College. We love putting on this panel every year in September, very close to the beginning of the academic year, because the Russians have always done something worthy of notice in the spring or summer right before we reconvene here at Wellesley. And this year is no exception. I mean, all you have to do is think of Sergei Skripal or think of the Helsinki summit, and I'm sure we'll be talking about all these, including the hacking of the election. It should be a very illuminating and entertaining evening. I'd like first to begin, as we sort of get settled and take our seats, to begin by thanking the people who made this possible. I really want to thank our unbelievably helpful and perspicacious administrative assistant, Katie Sango-Jackson. I don't think Katie is here tonight, but she made all this possible. I also want to thank all of our student administrative assistants who made this evening come off so well. Really appreciate your help. I also want to put in a plug for some upcoming events, just very quickly before we begin. One of these events is a reprise, a return performance by the Sheffield Chamber Players, a local chamber group who specialize in house music, and they're going to make Wellesley College their house on the 30th of September, which is a Sunday evening, 7:30 in the Pendleton West Grand Music Hall. If you haven't experienced that space yet, it's a brand new space. I highly recommend that you come. They're going to be offering a lecture and performance of Prokofiev's first string quartet, a fascinating piece of music. They will explain the piece and then perform it in its entirety, September 30th. The other event I wanted to tell you about was a lecture coming up in late October, October 24th, which is a Wednesday at 8 p.m. And that's going to take place in this very room, the library lecture room. Professor Polina Barskova is going to be offering a presentation entitled Leningrad at War, A City Speaks. I highly recommend you attend that as well. For you students in the room, I wanted to put in one quick plug for the Lake Baikal course. If you're at all interested in this course, which splits its activity between Wellesley College in the spring of 2019 and the shores of Lake Baikal in Siberia in August of 2019, please watch for the announcements of upcoming interviews and applications to be admitted to that course. Those applications and the announcements for them will be going out in early October. So yes, question?
Okay, this is a question, but what are the food options around Baikal? I want to go there, but I'm worried that there'll be no food.
No food options. I can reassure you right now in the most enthusiastic possible terms that the food there is tremendous, and it's of just about any kind you can shake a stick at.
Wide variety.
Wide variety, vegetarian, omnivorous, and so on. Okay. Also, before we get rolling and I introduce tonight's panelists, I would also like to introduce my fellow Russian Area Studies faculty who are not presenting tonight. So first of all, Alla Epstein, could you please stand and wave to the crowd? This is Alla in the Russian department. Ura. Oleg Kotsuba, who's my other colleague in the Russian department. And not joining us tonight, because he's on leave, is Igor Logvinenko, who's in Monterey, California, doing research. Okay, now without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our two panelists, the first of whom is Professor Valerie Sperling of Clark University, the Political Science Department. She's right here, and soon she will be up in front. Valerie teaches a variety of courses in comparative politics, including Russian politics, revolution and political violence, mass murder and genocide under communism, transitions to democracy, globalization and democracy, and introduction to women's studies. Her research interests include globalization and accountability, social movements, gender politics, patriotism and militarism, and state building in the post-communist region. Professor Sperling's most recent book, Sex, Politics, and Putin, Political Legitimacy in Russia with Oxford University Press, won the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies Davis Center Book Prize for the outstanding monograph on Russia, Eurasia, or Eastern Europe in social science. It also won the Association for Women in Slavic Studies Helt Prize, and that's H-E-L-D-T, named after Barbara Helt, who actually is a Wellesley College graduate from the 1960s. The Helt Prize for Best Book in Slavic, Eastern European, and Eurasian Women's Studies. As if that were not enough, Professor Sperling has a new book coming out with two co-authors about gender discrimination cases in domestic courts in Russia and Turkey, and also at the European Court of Human Rights. The title is Courting Gender Justice, Russia, Turkey, and the European Court of Human Rights. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce my very good friend and colleague of many years, Professor Nina Tumarkin, who is the Catherine Wasserman Davis Professor of Slavic Studies and Professor of History here at Wellesley College. She's also the director of the Russian Area Studies program at Wellesley. Professor Tumarkin's current research project, Politics of the Past in Putin's Russia, explores the many ways in which Russian political elites and groups, from liberal oppositionists to ultra-nationalists, have been remembering, celebrating, commemorating, condemning, condoning, forgetting, ignoring, and grappling with the country's troubled past and the complex history and legacy of the Soviet experience in World War II and its fateful aftermath. She examines the historical politics informing the state's usable past, quote unquote, to support regnant political and social structures and norms. Professor Tumarkin's work on the politics of multiple historical narratives builds on her previous books, which I should add are classics in the field of Soviet and Russian history, entitled The Living and the Dead, The Rise and Fall of the Cult of World War II in Russia, and Lenin Lives, The Lenin Cult in Soviet Russia. All right, without further ado, Professor Tumarkin, I believe you have the podium.
Good evening, everybody. And I just wanted to say to some of you who are in the back, there are seats in the front. They say reserved, but you can sit in them anyway, except my seat. Don't sit there. So please do feel free to move forward. So every September, I have the honor and pleasure of addressing members of the Wellesley College community and the wider Wellesley community at this annual Russia Now panel, and have noted as I was looking through my notes that last year and previous years I've begun by discussing Russian President Vladimir Putin. Well, the topic of my friend Vladimir, as George W. Bush used to call him, certainly must and will be addressed both by me and my colleague, Professor Valerie Sperling. But this evening, I thought it would be appropriate, cool, and liberating to actually start out with a subject of protest against President Putin that brought tens of thousands of people out onto the streets of cities all over the Russian Federation this past weekend and provoked a particularly hard crackdown that led to over 1,000 arrests. This is in Moscow. There are various signs. The one, I see, is this a laser pointer? Oh, well, the black one with white letters in the middle says, "Down with the Tsar." And this is in St. Petersburg, also many people marching, and this is an example of the crackdown and the arrests. They were really very harsh. They were police were beating people with clubs and treated them very badly. And the question is, why were these people protesting, what is the political situation that led to this? These were tens of thousands of people. So by Russian standards, it was these are serious protests. They're not massive, involving millions of people, as occurs nowadays every May 9th, when millions of people all over Russia and, in fact, in other countries celebrate Victory Day with holding aloft the portraits of their family members who died in the war. This is a picture of Moscow on May 9th, 2018, where just over 1 million people marched in procession. So we're talking about vast numbers, including, oddly enough, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who was visiting for the occasion and actually marched holding a portrait of a Jewish World War II veteran who later emigrated to Israel. So what prompted these protests in Moscow, Petersburg, and other cities of the Russian Federation? The protests were actually called by Russia's most visible and, no matter what else you might say about him, certainly courageous opposition leader or figure, Alexei Navalny, who, however, was detained on August 25th and held in prison for 30 days on a charge of violating protest laws, so he would not be able to figure prominently personally in the protests. So they were protesting against what the Kremlin called pension reforms and what people called robbery on the part of the state. In the era of Joseph Stalin in the 1930s, so we're talking 80 years ago, the Soviet state began to allot pensions to its citizens. That is to say, people could retire and draw on these pensions, something like our Social Security, not quite, but something like it. That women could draw on their pensions and retire at age 55 and men at 60. Now, this was a period when expectancy for males, life expectancy for males was just about 36 years. And about 42 years for females. That was the crisis period of the 1930s, where there had been a collectivization, man-made famine, the period of the terror. It had been higher in the late 1920s, but still only in the low 40s. So in the 80 years since that time, the pension age has not been raised. And even though the current life expectancy is almost now 72 years, which is an historic high for Russia, although it's still fairly low compared with other developed countries. What is, apropos of life expectancy, which is a very important demographic fact, what is striking is that in Russia, there's an enormous discrepancy between the life expectancy for women and for men. It's 11 years. Which is a larger discrepancy than that of any other country in the world, with male life expectancy at just over 66 years and female life expectancy at just over 77 years. And evidently the reason for this discrepancy has to do with what they call behavioral factors. The men drink way more than the women, and they drink enormous amounts. And they smoke. It's drinking and smoking are the two really, and despair, which go with it. So it seemed that the state, even though it wanted to and ought to have raised this retirement age in decades past, there was a kind of understanding that it was sort of a deal, I think, that the populace agreed, and this is true in the Putin years especially too, that the populace agreed that they would turn a blind eye to massive state corruption, to lack of all kinds of political and individual freedoms, in return for political stability and these meager but wide-ranging social benefits, and this very early retirement being one of them. People don't do very much in the way of organized childcare in Russia as it is. So women retiring at 55 become the grandmother who's taking care of the kids, absolutely necessary. So this was part of the deal. But the state really cannot anymore, really hasn't been able to for a long time, afford these kind of payouts. The current system really is not sustainable, and the Russian government doesn't collect enough taxes to support the system, and the oil gas revenues have been lower in recent years. If the Russian government were less corrupt, and if it taxed wealthy individuals through progressive tax, Russia doesn't have that, it has a flat tax of 13%, if it was less afraid of its own people and spent less on military security, there would be plenty of money to fund these meager pensions, but there isn't, and they are meager. They only represent about 30% of working salary, whereas in other developed countries, pensions represent anywhere from 45 to 70%. So people accept these tiny pensions, care for their grandchildren, try to find additional work. And in 2005, Putin announced that he, as long as he is president, he is not going to raise the retirement age. That was 2005. And people believed him. But with the economy in trouble and a diminished workforce, the Kremlin really has had to do something. The cohort nearing retirement, born between 1950 and 1960, I guess what the we would call them baby boomers. They didn't boom as much over there. Represent the largest working group in Russia because the younger group, the youngest group, born during the turbulent and troubled and impoverished 1990s, is a much smaller group for various economic reasons. And besides, Putin was just reelected for a fourth term with all kinds of campaign promises and not a word mentioned about the raising of the retirement age. So people responded by saying, the state is robbing us. And Putin tried to soften the blow by choosing to announce this rise of the retirement age on June 14th, 2018, which was the day of the opening of the World Cup, thinking the country is just starting a party and maybe they might not notice as much. And so he raised this announcement, the retirement age for women from 55 to 63, which is really considerable, and for men from 60 to 65. People were outraged, and it was clear that the state was going back on its implicit deal. Basically the deal was, you the people, let us govern how we like and get as rich as we can. We give you the right to retire at ages far below what is the practice in other countries. You keep quiet, and so on. And so now, these protests emerged right away, rather haphazardly in the summer, and immediately Putin's ratings plummeted from 82% approval rating in April to 67% in July. Now, by our standards, 67% approval rating is really very high. But I mean, President Trump's approval rating, when I last looked yesterday, was 36%. And Putin has gone back up to 70, so that's double, actually, literally. And Putin's crept back up a little bit because in August he was the Kremlin apparently was surprised by how vociferous the protest was, that he softened it by saying, well, women don't have to retire at 63, they can retire at 60. So going up just 5 years, although there was this outrageous, I'm sure Valerie Sperling thought it was outrageous too, this sort of macho-like justification that, you know, we'll do this because we have to protect our women, you know, sort of the weaker creatures. Actually, since women live so much longer, it's counterintuitive. They should be the ones who are working longer. But trust in Putin dropped to below 50%. Despite the president's efforts to distance himself from the unpopular reform, and then extremely low ratings for the rest of the government. The plan is set to take effect gradually over 10 years for men and a period of 16 years for women. So there's a great deal of paternalism in the way the Russian state governs. But the flip side of the bargain is that people expect real protection from the state. They actually protect something from the state. They seem to be willing to forego proper free elections and free press, but they are very upset about these reforms and less willing to tolerate what we would call hot points of discontent. Corruption, limits on public expression, the heavy-handedness of the police, and they're unwilling now to bear the cost of the war in Syria if it's going to cut into their own savings and their own future. So Navalny had called for these nationwide protests to coincide with regional elections on September 9th. And there were all of these protests and slogans. But you know, I got the impression that the pension reform was almost a pretext for a more generalized protest. That a lot of the slogans were not just about the pension. They were about corruption. As I said, they said, down with the Tsar. And also the protesters were not mostly the people who were going to be affected, the people in their 40s and 50s. There were many more younger people. And so trust in the Kremlin is going down. Also, even in television, still most people in Russia get their news from state-run television. But the trust in television is down. And now 73% of respondents get their news from television, down from 85% this spring. So just in a matter of a few months. It's changed. More and more people are getting their news from online sources. So many people now are really frustrated with the Kremlin, and I think that there might be more and more and bigger protests coming up in the future. There were very big protests at Putin's 4th inauguration, which was in May of 2018. And Putin's base, support base is changing, and young people are turning against him more. They had been very strong supporters of Putin, but now they're getting more frustrated. Also, the poorer segments of the population dislike the president, and then this, of course, this pension reform. So the president's approval rating is buoyed by the absence of real political competition. We know about that. And the Kremlin has also made a very big point of always comparing Putin, not even to his opponents, who are just not to be taken seriously, but to President Yeltsin of the 1990s, although that's getting to be a more distant memory. But the chaos of the 90s and the ineffectiveness of Yeltsin is brought up again and again and again. And people are saying about Putin, well, he may have problems, but at least he doesn't get dead drunk all the time. And we're not ashamed of him the way we were of President Yeltsin. So the Kremlin has noticed this decline in Putin and government ratings and is trying to do something about it. So right now, I would like to show a video, and from an excerpt, there's a new television show, which is a sort of I Love Putin show. Yeah. So you have to look at the subtitles because it's in Russian. This is just 1 minute.
Что Путин хотел сделать с брусникой? Кадры, которые еще никто не видел. 8 километров по горам.
All right, this is his vacation. He's in such great shape. This is in Tuva.
Вот уже сколько дней прошло, а у меня до сих пор ноги болят. Солнышко пригревает.
Охраняли ли президента во время отпуска на дикой природе? И нужна ли в тайге охрана Путина?
Представьте, что медведь дурак, что ли?
Дмитрий Песков расскажет, как составляется график президента и даже о том, кого любит Путин.
Путин не только любит детей, он вообще любит людей. Он очень человечный.
Okay, so he's a very humane person. At least on this vacation, he was fully clothed. Right, which, as you remember, last year he was not. So a few other points about Russia now, before we move on to Professor Sperling, who's going to be talking about foreign policy. The World Cup really was a boon to public diplomacy. It was an unqualified success, I think, for the hosts in promoting a positive view of the country and helping to overcome negative stereotypes. There had been a lot of doubts. Is Russia going to be able to pull it off? Security issues, terrorism. Just there were those doubts before the Sochi Olympics, which also worked out very well. And now, if you think about it, one of the most important diplomatic functions of international sport is to act as an opportunity for public diplomacy, allowing ordinary people to experience another society directly. And there were something almost 3 million foreigners who flooded into the country, into all the many host cities. And they discovered beautiful things about Russia. They reported that the Russians were very friendly. It was certainly the world's biggest party. And the tourists were especially gleeful and upbeat, particularly the Mexicans. I mean, I happened to myself arrive in Moscow on the first day of the World Cup. That was entirely by coincidence. I had bought my train ticket from St. Petersburg, not even remembering that there was a World Cup, but that's me, you know, right? So these are my favorite of the fans, actually, were the Egyptian fans. And then you could see the Mexicans back there with their sombreros. They had big orchestras, and then of course there were the Russian fans. So it was a very, very successful. It was a very successful boon. In terms of attitudes and opinions of Russian citizens, polls have shown, really even beginning this summer, that Russians are more willing to protest than they have been ever in the past 2 decades, although many others said they wouldn't protest themselves, so the older people didn't go, the younger people did. But there are also some very unfortunate and I think dangerous mood predictors coming out. Nearly 2/3 of Russians believe that there's an organized group of people working to minimize Russia's role in history and subvert its traditional values using gay propaganda. You know, it's a very homophobic society, and there are these anti-gay propaganda laws. Russia has positioned itself as a defender of conservative values in the face of European liberalism. And many people, 66% of Russians polled in this poll agreed with the statement that there's a group of people who seek to rewrite Russian history and replace the historical fact in order to hurt Russia and diminish its greatness. Which brings me to my last observation. On the deeply conservative, I would say even obscurantist, Russian Orthodox Church and its recently expanded role as shaper and guardian of Russian historical memory. This was evident on July 17th of 2018, when Russia commemorated the 100th anniversary of the murder of the Romanovs by the Bolsheviks on July 17th, 1918, and there was a procession of over 100,000 people. That was an all-night sort of vigil procession led by the Russian Patriarch Kirill in the city of Yekaterinburg, where the Romanov, Nicholas II and his wife and children had been murdered. Even more striking is a big project to create Russian history museums. There was really Kremlin was very unsuccessful to put together a unified textbook that would promote a narrative, a single narrative. So they started building these museums. It was the church who got a huge amount of funding from Gazprom, the great gas conglomerate, gas giant, to put together these museums with a plan of 27 museums in 27 different cities. They're called Russia, My History. They've already opened 15 of them. I went to the one in Moscow, and it's very, very conservative and very much based on an adulation of the Romanovs. That's actually extremely important. Also very clerical and shows a great deal about how priests have suffered. And so, and it's very nationalistic. If you go out, there's on the outside, there's a portrait of Putin's favorite Russian emperor, Alexander III, who was nationalist, anti-Semitic, terribly anti-Semitic. He once said, "In my heart, I am always happy when they beat the Jews," which is not a nice thing to think, you know, or say. And so they had a quote by him that Putin likes to quote, which is, "Russia has but 2 allies on whom she can count, her army and her navy." And then when you go into this exhibit, the Romanovs were always good. And so if all the Romanovs were good, then and Nicholas I, for example, who lost the Crimean War, was a good monarch. Why did he lose the Crimean War? If everything was so excellent under Catherine the Great, why was there an enormous peasant revolt during her reign? If Imperial Russia was so good, what are the origins of the collapse of the monarchy? And the answer is conspiracies. That enemies from outside Russia, hostile internal forces, particularly liberals, always at every stage hampered this wonderful Romanov dynasty. And so if you accept the story offered by the organizers of the exhibition, then only a conspiracy theory can explain it all. And the course of Russian history cannot be understood in any other way, and that is dark and dangerous. I'll end with dark and dangerous and pass the mic and the podium and your attention over to my wonderful colleague, Valerie Sperling. Thank you.
Okay. So Professor Tumarkin talked about nationalism, and this is a nice segue into the topic that I'm taking up today, which is Russian foreign policy. So foreign policy is political and it's economic, and it's very much connected to domestic politics. And a lot of the foreign policy decisions that have been made in Russia in recent years have, as you would expect, had to do with Russia's national interest, but they've also been pitched to a domestic audience as much as to other audiences in the international system. So just as at home, a lot of the story has been about nationalism under Putin, in foreign policy too, the message is about asserting sovereignty, national sovereignty, showing Russia's strength and influence as a power on the international stage, and trying to differentiate Russia from the liberal West. So I'm going to talk about a few aspects of Russia's foreign policy this evening. I want to touch on the superpower relationship, Russia's relationship with the United States, which washes over into the other topics that I'm going to mention, namely the ongoing Ukraine crisis and also the war in Syria. So let's start with the relationship between the superpowers, Russia and the United States. So over the last few years, there's been a lot of talk about being engaged in a new Cold War. This is a way of saying that tensions are high between Russia and the U.S., that our national interests appear to be opposed to each other's. There's a risk of escalation. It's not clear what the rules of engagement are, and so on. However, there are some big differences between what we have now and the original Cold War that followed World War II and lasted up until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and what we have now. So we're not in the midst of an arms race now. We're not in the midst of an ideological conflict either. It's not capitalism versus communism anymore. So that's good. But in the last 5 years, the relationship has been very rocky, and I will talk about some of the reasons why that is. But with Trump's election to the presidency in the United States, at least the personal relationship between the two heads of state seemed to improve, although not without a great deal of speculation as to why these two were getting along so well. Speculation that focused on, Putin having some kind of personal dirt on Trump, some kind of compromising material, or Trump's election campaign having maybe worked with people on Putin's team to try and help him win the presidential election in 2016. Now, there was a lot of discussion about this in July when Trump and Putin had their first summit meeting in Helsinki, Finland. The general consensus was that the summit was a real win for Putin. Trump didn't challenge him on anything. He didn't challenge him on gay rights or human rights violations or the mistreatment of political opponents or or of journalists, and also didn't challenge him on the intervention in the U.S. election either. So having the summit was good for Putin in that it legitimates him for the U.S. president to say, Putin is a great guy. And because it showcases Russia as an equal to the United States on the world stage. Now, there was an interesting moment that you probably heard about at the summit press conference during the Q&A when Trump was asked whether he thought that Russia had intervened in the U.S. election in 2016. And Trump said Putin very strongly denied it. So he still seemed to be inclined to side with Putin instead of with the variety of U.S. intelligence agencies and military advisors and the diplomatic corps who think differently. Professor Tom Nichols at the Rhode Island Naval War College made an interesting point in a lecture that I attended recently about the election intervention and the Mueller investigation, namely that Putin and the Russian government, by intervening, by releasing the hacked Democratic National Committee emails, they thought that they would be undermining a Hillary Clinton presidency. They never dreamed that Trump would win the election or that there would be any kind of investigation. But that the Mueller investigation has gotten way too close for comfort to the Russian government and to revealing whatever additional connections there are. So then what was the purpose of Russia's interference in the US election? It seems to me that maybe the purpose was less to help Trump win than to make democracy look like a chaotic, bad system, or to make the elections themselves look less reliable, again, to sort of undermine Clinton. The Russian journalist Yulia Latinina, at a talk at Harvard in May, made the point that the Russian internet bots and trolls were there to exploit weak points in U.S. society, to basically give a louder voice to the disruptive political actors who appear to be marginal. So Trump, Sanders, white supremacists, they supported these diametrically opposed forces. And that very much echoes what the Russian government has done in European countries too, supporting both the far right and the far left in Europe, like Marine Le Pen in France and the left-wing Syriza party in Greece. So there was also some Russian financial support for Brexit in the UK referendum about staying in the EU. So the idea behind these kinds of interventions is to weaken the US-Europe alliance and to drive wedges among states in the EU. And the Russian regime might have also tried to help Trump in order to get some help from Trump in case he was elected. Particularly to rescind the economic sanctions that the United States imposed on Russia after Russia's intervention in Ukraine in 2014. Although this seems less likely because they really could not have thought that Trump would win. And I will say more about Ukraine and the sanctions in a few minutes. So where is there room for cooperation in this superpower relationship? One obvious area for cooperation is on nuclear weapons. This has long been an area where the superpowers have made agreements and found common ground because of the danger of the threat entailed in not having agreements. So what kinds of agreements are or could be on the table? First, there is the New START agreement that runs through 2021, but it could be extended. And what it does is it limits the number of nuclear warheads that each side can have at 1,500. And these are like the land-based nuclear weapons, the nuclear weapons on submarines, the ones on aircraft, on bombers, in other words. It allows for inspections, and it was signed by Putin and President Obama in 2010. So they could build on that. There is also the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, which outlaws both countries from making ground-launched ballistic missiles and cruise missiles that are of medium range, so 500 to 5,500 kilometers. That treaty is currently in a state of suspended animation because the U.S. has accused Russia of violating it because Russia has a new cruise missile that goes over 500 kilometers. And so Congress, in turn, approved funding to develop a U.S. version of that kind of missile. And this is a very long-standing treaty, as you can see. We've got Gorbachev and Reagan who signed it in the late 1980s. So that treaty could be reaffirmed, and they could work out the problems. And they could also cooperate on preventing nuclear weapons proliferation in space, right? They could stop the deployment of weapons in space, in orbit, and so on. There is a 1967 treaty that bans weapons of mass destruction in space, but both sides are now working on anti-satellite weapons for space, and there's room for an agreement to stop those kinds of developments. You could also imagine U.S. and Russia working together on stopping terrorism. At the summit, Russia proposed establishing a working group on that topic and also establishing a cybersecurity working group and a Russian-American business forum, although I think right now the idea of Russian investment in U.S. business is not particularly welcome. And there are sanctions, of course, on a number of Russian business people who are connected to Putin's government. So that kind of agreement might be problematic. Another interesting sign that suggests room for cooperation is that Russian attitudes toward the U.S. are actually much better than they have been for several years now. This could be because of Trump and his apparent affection for Putin, or it could be exhaustion with the Russian government's ongoing position that the West is Russia's enemy and is out to weaken the Russian state. In August, a poll by the most reliable public opinion polling firm in Russia, the Levada Center, showed a sharp increase in the percentage of Russians who had a positive attitude toward the U.S. So 42% in August said they had a positive view of the U.S. at the end of July versus only 20% in May. And only 40% had a negative view of the U.S., down from 69% who had had a negative view in May. Likewise, 42% of Russians surveyed said they felt positive toward the EU at the end of July, up from 27% in May. And 68% of the Russian public apparently also said they did not want to live in a, quote, besieged fortress and fight with the West, and they preferred that relations be improved. So to the extent that Putin has been justifying his rule on the basis that it's important to defend Russia against the West and against liberal Western values, the population's improving view of the West may become a problem for Putin, or it might not last. It might just be, an artifact of the summit in July. Now, of course, central to foreign policy matters in Russia is the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, which I mentioned earlier. This is very much tied up with the U.S.-Russia relationship and the relationship between Russia and NATO, NATO being the military alliance that brings together the West European states and the U.S. and Canada, and the East European states and the 3 Baltic countries, basically up to the border of the rest of the former Soviet Union. Things between Russia and the United States took a turn for the worse during Putin's third term as president with regard to Ukraine. And Putin's third term, as you know, starts in 2012. The next year, so in November of 2013, Ukraine's government, which had been planning to sign an economic agreement with the European Union, got talked out of it by Russia and signed an economic agreement with Russia instead. And as you probably recall, this led to big protests in Ukraine, protests which progressively became more and more anti-Russian and more opposed to Ukraine's president, Viktor Yanukovych, who was seen himself as being too pro-Russia. So in February 2014, facing these protests, Yanukovych fled and the Ukrainian government fell in what was basically like a quick, popular nationalist revolution. Shortly thereafter, the Ukrainian parliament rescinded a law that had enabled Russian to be treated as an official language in parts of Ukraine where more than 10% of the population was Russian-speaking. And then a number of things happened. Within a week, the acting president of Ukraine vetoed the decision to rescind the language law, meaning that Russian would still be treated as an official language in those parts of Ukraine. But Russian speakers had gotten the initial message, and pro-Russian protests over this Ukrainian revolution broke out in the eastern and southern provinces of Ukraine. Soon, an armed rebellion with the assistance from Russia broke out in 2 of Ukraine's eastern provinces, in Donetsk and Luhansk. And these places are dominated by Ukrainian citizens who speak Russian. And they were worried about how were Russian speakers going to be treated in this new Ukraine. So Putin's government supported the separatists with arms and then with Russian troops, at first denying that there were Russian troops present and then being kind of vague and non-committal about the Russian advisors who were, or military specialists and so on, who were in these breakaway regions of Ukraine. In July of 2014, Russian-supported separatists in Ukraine shot down a passenger plane over eastern Ukraine. That was Malaysian Airlines MH17, and the U.S. imposed sanctions on a series of Russian oil and defense companies, and Putin responded by banning the import of foods from countries that had sanctioned Russia. So he basically cut off food imports from the United States and from Western Europe. The other important foreign policy move made by Russia as the new anti-Russian government took power in Ukraine was to take over Crimea, which is the region of Ukraine, you can see it on the map there, that sort of sticks out into the Black Sea. Russian military forces entered and occupied Crimea, and a referendum was held, resulting in 96% of the Crimean voting public supposedly endorsing the integration of Crimea into the Russian state, after which Crimea was indeed annexed by Russia. There was a big propaganda campaign within Russia justifying this violation of international law, and the focus of the justification was simply the assertion that Crimea belonged to Russia, that Crimea was ours, Krim nash. The Russian population was thrilled about this. It was a big nationalist, patriotic boost for Putin, whose approval ratings went from around 69% to 88% approval in October of 2014. Now, a significant part of the reason why Putin's government acted to occupy and then absorb Crimea was that a major part of Russia's Navy, the Black Sea Fleet, is resident in Sevastopol in Crimea in the Black Sea. There was some uncertainty, I guess, as to whether the new anti-Russian Ukrainian government would continue to lease that naval base to Russia, as the Ukrainian government had done until that time. And of course, this was the naval base in the Soviet era, when there was no national boundary between Russia and Ukraine, so it wasn't an issue. So when taking Crimea, this was kind of a way of guaranteeing Russian ongoing access to the naval base without having to renegotiate the cost or the potential cost. All right, however pleasing this absorption of Crimea may have been for the Russian population, it was a violation of international law, and there were ramifications for Russia. So the U.S. led the move to kick Russia out of the G8, which is composed of the leadership of the world's most powerful, highly industrialized states, like the U.S. and the U.K. and France and Germany and Japan, Italy, and Canada. And in March of 2014, the U.S. imposed sanctions on certain Russian oligarchs and companies involved in Crimea, and then put some sanctions also on bank transactions and oil and gas technology imports. Now, these may not have been particularly painful sanctions for Russia, but at the same time, the price of oil was falling, and until fairly recently, when that turned around, the sanctions in combination, especially with the oil prices, became a problem for the Russian budget that Professor Tumarkin was talking about with regard to being able to pay for all these pensions. Now, at this point in 2018, the crisis in Ukraine has become a low key military conflict. So it's not a full-fledged war in the sense it's not going to end with territory changing hands the way it often would at the end of a full-fledged war. There was a ceasefire signed at the end of 2016, although it didn't bring, a real finish to the conflict. From Russia's perspective, the goal of the conflict is to keep it going at this low level, just enough to wreak political havoc in Ukraine, to keep Ukraine unsettled and not at peace, because that means as long as Ukraine is in that condition, it can't join NATO and it can't join the EU. So this is what's called a frozen conflict, right? It's not a hot war, but it's not resolved. What would Russia like? Russia would like legal recognition of those eastern Ukrainian regions' autonomy from Ukraine. You could amend the Ukrainian constitution and achieve this. The US and Europe are not on board with that solution. The US is also officially not on board with the annexation of Crimea by Russia, despite President Trump's having said before the Helsinki summit that since the people of Crimea speak Russian, Crimea is Russian, which sent the message to Putin that Trump thinks it makes sense for Crimea to be part of Russia. All right, something else I want to touch on briefly is Russian foreign policy in Europe. I had mentioned some of Russia's political aims with regard to the EU, but Russian foreign policy in Europe is also quite tied up with economics, because the US and Russia don't have that extensive a trade relationship, but the EU is actually Russia's biggest trading partner, and there are some important connections between Russia and Western Europe, particularly the provision of Russian gas to Germany, the UK, France, Italy, and Turkey. Now, how does it get there? It gets to Europe through pipelines, and Russia has worked to get the Nord Stream pipelines established so that Russia doesn't have to ship their gas out through less politically reliable territory, like Ukraine or even Poland, on its way to Europe. The Russian economy is still highly reliant on the export of oil and gas, as well as of metals and chemicals. So this is an important relationship. Oil and gas make up 70% of Russia's export and 50% of the state's revenues. So what that means is that the health of Russia's economy depends to a large extent on access to Russian oil and gas and on the price of that oil and gas. All right, the other area of Russian foreign policy that I want to touch on is the civil war and international conflict in Syria. In September 2015, Russia got involved in the Syrian conflict with airstrikes that were intended to support the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad. Because the U.S. is also involved in that conflict, there have been some efforts to have the U.S. and the Russian military forces there talk to each other to make sure they don't attack each other by accident and escalate the conflict into something even more frightening than it already is. This process of them talking to each other is called deconfliction, right? Trying to prevent conflict. Now, one particularly interesting aspect of Russia's involvement in Syria that has to do with this deconfliction is the use of a Russian private military company there, a company called PMC Wagner. Which looks like Wagner when you see it in English. This company is owned by Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is one of the major businessmen who's close to the Kremlin, and who also owns the Internet Research Agency, which is that troll company that was involved in the internet-based intervention during the U.S. Elections in 2016. With regard to Wagner's involvement in Syria and the risk of conflict with U.S.-backed forces, there was a very interesting development in February of this year, where about 500 pro-Assad fighters in eastern Syria crossed from a Russian-controlled area into a U.S.-controlled area, and they used Russian weapons to attack U.S.-based Kurdish forces who were guarding a Conoco natural gas plant there. The U.S. side retaliated with massive force, including U.S. airstrikes, and they defeated this group of 500 pro-Assad fighters, most of whom turned out to speak Russian and were working for this Wagner private military company and included Russian and pro-Russian veterans of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. The deconfliction hotline was used before, during, and after the U.S. airstrikes, and despite the obvious casualties on the Russian side, the Russian military denied that they had any forces involved, and they didn't make any fuss about it, as Professor Kim Martin at Barnard described in an analysis that she wrote about this incident. So what was going on there? The way that Wagner's involvement in Syria works is that the company's private contractors, who are armed, military forces, they work for President Assad's government as proxies for Russia's government. So in other words, we don't send Russian troops, we send this kind of private military force. And the way they get paid is that the company gets a part of the profits from the oil wells and refineries that they are able to hold or capture from the Syrian regime's adversaries, like what they were trying to do when they attacked the Kurdish forces that were guarding the Conoco plant. But they failed. The use of private military companies is a very interesting innovation in international conflict. As you know, the U.S. uses private military forces. We have done that in Iraq as well. And you can see how this would create all kinds of accountability problems and also plausible deniability, because the Russian government can say our forces weren't involved, which is technically true, but if Russia is controlling the private military forces, they get to be involved without direct acknowledgement. Now, I bring Wagner up because I think we're going to continue to hear about it. Wagner was in the news more recently when there were some reports last month about the killing of 3 Russian journalists in the Central African Republic. I don't know if any of you heard about that, and I can talk about that more in the Q&A if you're interested. But these Russian journalists were investigating Wagner, and it turns out that Russia has agreements with the Central African Republic's government to explore natural resources, like their alluvial diamond fields and gold mines. But this is challenging because the region isn't stable and safe. So anyway, instead of sending Russian military forces there, the idea is that if the private military company can hold those areas and get control of the mining regions, then they can get paid through some portion of those natural resources that they can secure. So one could teach an entire course on Russian foreign policy. I've just tried to give you a sense of some of the areas of interest, things to keep your eyes on as you watch the news, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, panelists. You just heard from a distinguished political scientist, a distinguished historian. Professor Tumarkin and Professor Sperling will now take a seat at the table, and we will open the floor to questions for about half an hour, give or take, until about 9:30 maybe, depending on how it goes. So if you have a question, please go ahead and kick it off. Yeah, please go ahead.
So I'm not sure if you heard about it, but there was like the biggest Russian military exercise from Soviet Union. It was like, article was published like 6 hours ago. And do you think that is just actually showing off the power of Russia, like to other countries, like showing off the power, or do you think that the exercise is actually practical, or what is your opinion on that?
Yeah, so I don't know about it concretely, but I think states are always doing the same thing, right? When they engage in a military exercise. In Russia's case, it's about both demonstrating to the United States and also actually to China that this is a very powerful, very prepared state. Contrast in the 1990s, the Russian state's military reputation really suffered because of the war in Chechnya, where where the Russian army showed how unprepared it was, and it was just kind of a general. There was, in addition to that, sort of a general withdrawal of Russian military preparedness all around the world. Oh, sorry, all around. Is it on? Is it good? All around the world. So in a way, right, this. Large military exercises are about showing that Russia is prepared and can't be pushed around, and that's a message both for the international community and also domestically. So I think that's generally the purpose of those kinds of exercises. What's a little scary is that depending on where they are and and how well they're controlled, what you start to worry about is what happens now if there's some kind of a border skirmish, let's say with one of the Baltic states. What you worry about is because the United States and the Trump administration has seemed so reluctant to confront Russia on anything, you just sort of worry, what if Putin takes that message to mean that whatever he does is fine, that Trump is always going to have his back and say, oh, well, Crimea, of course, should be with Russia because, the people speak Russian. So I think, that's not just, I guess, about military exercises, but that's that's just sort of the risk of becoming more adventurous in a military way.
I could just add in, are you talking about the huge military drills exercise they just had that were the biggest that they had had since the Soviet period, right? So that was jointly with China.
Oh.
Yes, and it was in the Far East, right on the Chinese border. So in a way, it was also meant to show that there's a rapprochement with China and that the West better take note that there's a closeness there. So I just want to add that
Absolutely.
part. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Do you see any effect on Putin if the church in Ukraine actually does separate from the church in Russia?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it would be a great disappointment. But the church in Russia is so nationalistic right now, and even so suspicious of Ukraine that could be spun to say that the Ukrainians anyway aren't real Orthodox, and so on. I think it would just draw the Russians into more of an ultra-nationalism of their own, that the Russian is the only true church. That's what I think. I don't know whether you think so. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm from Ukraine myself, and I really liked to see how wisely you put it here for the audience. But my question is, during such presentations, the more I attend them, I can see like how much we remember Ukraine, but unfortunately we do not remember the conflict in Georgia that took place in 2008. Why do you think that happens? Why do we diminish its significance nowadays?
Well, we've just commemorated the 10th anniversary, actually, of the conflict in Georgia. So I think when you say we, actually, who's we? You mean the United States? No, when you said we don't remember.
People usually, when the presentations happen, Ukraine gets the spotlight. I understand it's more recent, but why Georgia is kind of put aside?
I mean, I think at the time there was a lot of attention to the conflict in Georgia.
John McCain was especially very enthusiastic about it.
I think it was a really hot issue, at the time, because again, it sort of symbolized Russia's, although, it's not Russia that started that conflict.
No, it was very
right?
complicated.
Yeah, so that is a complicated
pox on both
one.
their houses
right,
was
right.
the way I looked at it.
Right. But at the time, I think it did just sort of spur more concern about Russian power in the former Soviet neighborhood, and what would Russia be able to do, and what external resources would states like Georgia or Ukraine have to call upon, in the face of Russian aggression if they were to confront it. And that continues to be a big issue. It's kind of like Hungary in 1956. Is the West really going to come to their aid and rescue of these countries that have sort of newly been taken over by the Soviet Union? Well, probably not. So I think that's what the Georgian conflict brought to the fore at the time.
Right, but the Ukraine crisis is still war is still ongoing.
Yeah.
So naturally, it's going to be much more. Yeah, maybe Oleg, you want to add something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Well,
he's Ukrainian too.
I don't want to add anything, but maybe just kind of to bring up the Budapest Memorandum, which was a very important agreement for Ukraine, because Ukraine gave up this third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world. Right? At that time, China, France, and other partners combined did not have as many nuclear warheads. And then kind of the assurances, the security assurances that were given to Ukraine by Russia, by United States, by UK, and others in the end were not acted upon. But kind of the other question I wanted to ask about is, Professor Tumarkin mentioned Navalny as kind of the leader of the Russian opposition, and some analysts have voiced the opinion that maybe even if the opposition came to power, not a lot would change in Russia's foreign policies or foreign politics. Lidia Shevtsova is among them, who says that the kind of the basic system of Russian government and Russian opposition to the West has stayed the same since the Tsarist times. The system remains the same. It changes faces, but basically it's the same. Another contribution in that regard is Paul Denier's recent article about Russia's conflict with the West, where he emphasizes that there are basically three big elements to it, and unless those are resolved, we are not going to see a lasting kind of deconflictization with the West. And so those are the great power aspirations, the claim to have a certain sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, but especially in the former states of the Soviet Union, and finally the antagonism to the democratic systems in general, right? So kind of the Russia's autocracy demands from it to oppose the democratic regimes. And so then what he says basically, Russia, one way that Russia could do it is to follow Germany's example, something like Germany did after World War II, where Germany's neighbors had very legitimate fears of German power, and so Germany decided to tie its power and its also economic potency within the institutions of the European Union. And so my question is basically if at all there is a chance for any Russian positional leader, be it Navalny or be it Sobchak, whether or not there's a chance to change that system, to break it, and to kind of to maybe give up part of that, great power aspiration and so on, and instead embracing a democratic society.
Yeah, I think we should both address it. Well, I mean, I really love Lila Shevtsova dearly, but she tends to be hyperbolic. And to say that Navalny would change nothing. Now, he is not my favorite person in the world. I mean, he is ultra-nationalist and himself not particularly a liberal. But he's not Putin. And to say that the system hasn't changed since Tsarist times is just simplistic and, reminds us that she's not an historian. That said, I think that it's hard to imagine Russia giving up what it considers its, shall we call it, delicately special relationship and special interests in the post-Soviet space. That seems to be very deep-seated, and I don't know what you think about that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess what I would say is, we have an example, which is the Yeltsin regime in the 1990s, right, where where Russia was getting a lot of financial aid from the West, and I think almost by dint of the fact they didn't have another choice, Russia really backed off from foreign policy interventions and and so on. But the problem with that model is that Yeltsin really got canned for it, and as a result, we got Putin. Right? I mean, the whole idea of having to bring Russia off its knees and get back onto the international stage, I do think it would be challenging for any leader in Russia not to assume the mantle of a superpower, even though by any imaginable measure other than having nuclear weapons, Russia's not a superpower. I mean, I think the Russian economy is like the size of the Texas economy or something. It's like it doesn't come close.
2.5% GDP. Yeah. Well, I mean, it seems to me that I agree that we really have to understand that this is a country that would be not capable. I don't think Russia calls herself a superpower anyway. I think it's a great power. And the latest Levada poll I saw said that something like 86% of Russians believe that Russia must be a great power, maybe not a superpower. So that would still be of extremely importance.
Yeah, a question about the polling. You mentioned a lot of polling results and how they fluctuated quite greatly. And I was wondering to what extent Putin cares about what those polling numbers mean, and because they fluctuate depending on the month, right? So does that play a great deal into his domestic policy, his foreign policy? And do you see the pension protests, which were kind of a big deal, as a marker of any greater public unrest, or do you think it's just another fad where the polling just keeps going up and down?
Should we both answer that?
Sure.
Right. Well, first of all, I think that the idea of sort of the greater friendliness toward the West and positive attitude toward the West, I would add in another factor. I think the World Cup. This was after the World Cup, and there were so many Western tourists and so on. So and Russia was so well viewed. So I think that was really very important. In terms of what Putin how he's reacted, until last March, he was never not up for re-election. I mean, he was always planning to get re-elected again. So we don't exactly, now that he's sort of lame duck till 2024 because it's a 6-year term, still it's unclear what the effects are going to be. But as soon as the ratings went down even a little bit, they come up with this TV show and do everything they can to get his ratings back up. So we don't know, of course, what Putin personally thinks or cares about. But I suspect that at least Putin's handlers are very sensitive to these polling figures and approval ratings. What do you think?
I would agree. And one of the things that we know is that economic protests tend to quickly turn political. So economic protests, things that start out looking like economic protests, quickly turn political. So if you think back to 1989 in the Soviet Union, the economic protest by coal miners, which began really as economic issues. We can't get soap. We walk out of the mines and we're covered with coal and we can't even get soap. That rapidly became political in nature. Those protests did. So I think, and that's just sort of a known, sort of a known fact, because there's something wrong with the economy. Well, who do we blame? Well, as soon as you start blaming somebody, that becomes a political problem. So I'm sure that the Putin regime is concerned about, the protests, about his popularity, and so on. At the same time, I also remember back, whatever it was, a decade ago, when Putin's government decided to change the benefits that retired people and some other people also got, things like free rides on the metro, things like that, when they decided to monetize those benefits and give people instead X amount of money instead of the benefits that they were receiving before. And there were big protests about that because people, are not stupid, and they understand that, like, today you give me $25, and then a year from now, because of inflation, my $25 is worth $15. But it used to be that I could get on the subway and go wherever I wanted for free. So there were big protests about that, and they died out. There are significant penalties in Russia now for unsanctioned protests, for protests that are not permitted. And so it's very hard to sustain kind of a regime of big protests and sustained protests. They can grant a permit for a protest, not in the middle of Moscow, but like outside of the city center. And after a while, it just stops. You think about the massive protests against electoral fraud that started in Russia in December of 2011 after the parliamentary elections, that continued sort of on into February of 2012 and even on to June of 2012. And then they passed these laws that said you can get sanctioned an enormous amount of money for holding an unapproved protest. And you know what? Like, the protests die out. So I wouldn't anticipate that this is really going to bring down the regime or something like that.
Oh, well.
Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
I wondered what significance you give to the recent Russian and Chinese demonstration of might in their parades. Well, I guess war games, we would call them. Is there a future truly in collaboration between these two powers?
Yeah, I mean, I think China is the country to watch, and what options does Russia really have, right? Russia needs buyers for its natural resources, and China needs those natural resources because of its enormous and rapid industrial and ongoing development. And so that Russia-China relationship is kind of the natural one that you would expect from a from a realpolitik perspective, right? That these two countries are going to have to get together. They're both dictatorships. They understand each other. They get along fine. It's been a long time since the Soviet Union and China broke up in 1960. I think they're over that. Neither of them have human rights concerns. So you can sort of envision. You can sort of envision down the line that these two are going to support each other. One of the things that I find concerning is the growing Chinese tendency to pay for infrastructure projects in the third world. And that obviates the need for things like the World Bank and the IMF, which tend to put conditionalities on their loans. China will give, loan money and not insist on any kind of environmental protection or indigenous population protection. And so I can sort of envision that Russia-China axis growing stronger, by default. And if you take we all get very focused on the present, but if you take kind of the long perspective, I think China, you know, the United States is already on its downswing, right? Like, yeah, we've plateaued somewhere and we're on the decline, and it's China that we have to be, you know, that we have to be worried about. They own us, you know, basically.
Okay. Yeah, Howard.
Well. I'd like to ask a couple questions about the population of Russia. It's my impression that over many years the population was shrinking, and there are demographic factors involved in that, life expectancy for one and birth rate for another. But my question is, how much of that over time do you think has been the result of people just simply leaving, voting with their feet and going elsewhere? Because in the world of technology and internet, the grass could look pretty greener on other places. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. So, so the brain drain issue is very real, and I'm right now on a dissertation committee of a student in Berlin, Anna Schwenk, who's writing about youth policy, like government policy towards youth in Russia, and she's exploring these government-sponsored summer camps that Russia has been having, like starting in the Putin era and continuing on up to today, both federal level and also regional level camps. And what she finds is that at these in these youth camps, they're sort of politicized youth camps. They focus on two things. One is entrepreneurship and the importance of, you know, the sort of like neoliberal model where you shouldn't expect too much from the state now. You should become an entrepreneur. You should, you know, do things independently. But at the same time, what you do should be done for the benefit of the collective. So what you do should be done for the benefit of the state on the whole. So it's not the sort of American individualism bootstrap sort of thing, but it's something much more related to that, to patriotism and nationalism. And so what I think the state is trying to inculcate in young people is the idea that being patriotic means being an entrepreneur and staying in Russia, you know, and not leaving. And she did all these interviews with young people who went to these youth camps, and they're not like young meaning 14. They're you know, they go up to like age 30 or so, and they all talked about the importance of patriotism and not wanting to leave Russia. And I can even say that interviewing a completely different set of you know, of people. When I wrote Sex, Politics, and Putin, I was interviewing pro-Putin youth, and I was interviewing anti-Putin youth. And I asked them all, because I was interested in patriotism, you know, what does patriotism mean to you? And they all talked about, you know, loving your country and loving Russia. And they all said, just sort of spontaneously, I would not leave Russia. You know, I need to make Russia a better place, if it's the anti-Kremlin people, or, you know, it would just be wrong to leave my country. So I think the state is very much aware of that brain drain problem and is applying these patriotic education programs that they've had now since the year 2000 to try to attenuate, to try to slow that drain. Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that the population of the Russian Federation gets larger because of migrants. So there are all these migrant laborers coming in from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, well, particularly Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. So when you say the Russian population, it's not clear whether you mean the ethnic Russian population or the citizenry of the Russian Federation, which is multinational.
And they also, you know, they have had also now for some years a maternity capital program where if you have more than, you know,
a lot.
Yeah, exactly. If you have more than 2 kids, you get extra benefits from the state that you can use, you know, towards education, and so there's certainly an awareness that this is a problem, and they're trying as best they can to, you know, to stop it or prevent it. Yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, I just wanted to go back to the point about Georgia's conflict. I'm from Georgia, and like, I just wanted to say the conflict is definitely not over there. In fact, like Russian troops are literally kidnapping people every day. Like people go to sleep and like next day they find themselves on the other side of the so-called border, and they're killing people. And like I think that the fact that in 2008 international community didn't have like strong enough response to whatever happened in Georgia, that was one of the biggest reasons why we had Ukraine in 2014. So what do you think the international community's response should be now so that we don't get like similar things happening all around the countries that are neighboring Russia?
Well, I could say something about that. So one thing, so one thing to keep in mind is that there are these, and Georgia is one of them, Ukraine is one of them. There are these frozen conflicts all around that Soviet perimeter. So, like even in Moldova, right? And nobody talks about Moldova, right? I mean, try to find somebody who's going to talk about Transnistria in Moldova, right? So, the problem, I think the problem is what the level of risk that's involved for Western Europe and for the United States and other NATO members of actually getting militarily involved. Because short of that, what can you do? I mean, you can impose sanctions on Russia, which they did now. Maybe they should have done it, with more emphasis, say, in 2008, and drawn, a line in the sand. But what do you do once you draw the line? I mean, you're going to send, American troops to Georgia? Like, it just seems politically completely infeasible, especially for the United States, because the United States is engaged, up to its neck in, endless wars now in, Afghanistan and in Iraq. It's been 17 years since the United States has been involved in Afghanistan, right? And so when you think about that, it's like it's a little difficult to imagine how concretely that's going to get resolved. And from the Western European perspective, it's also very challenging because until Germany becomes, a solar power, it's going to be awfully difficult for Germany to really oppose, in a big way, any kind of Russian foreign policy action. It's unfortunate, but I think it's the case.
Because it's so dependent on Russian gas.
Because they're so dependent on Russian gas, exactly.
Isn't that the same for Turkey and Greece and probably the Balkans?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, look, there are other states who protest, right? So like Poland, for example, has been very opposed, and so is Ukraine, very opposed to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And the United States is opposed to it because the United States has this pipe dream idea that you could just sort of replace that gas with American gas that you're going to put on ships and send over for like 10 times the cost to Western Europe. So, but it's an extremely complicated, it's a problem of international relations at the end of the day. Other thoughts?
Right. Well, then, and then when people, got worried about, is Russia going to now attack one of the Baltic countries? Yeah. Those are NATO countries. I mean, Russia is not idiotic enough to attack a NATO country. It just wouldn't happen.
Yeah. So that's my. I know there's a problem. That's why Russia is doing all these things in Ukraine and Georgia, because unless the country resolves its problems, you can't join NATO, but what if they amend that article for some time, let these countries join NATO so that the conflict doesn't continue anymore. I think there are ways around it somehow, but yeah, there's that gas thing.
I think that would be very problematic for Russia to have Ukraine and Georgia join NATO.
Oh yeah. I don't think they would be up for that at all.
It's not. I don't think that's going to happen for a while. Right.
Okay, maybe one more question from the audience. Someone who hasn't already asked one. Okay, the last question goes to you.
It's more about the point that you mentioned about the Baltic states. I was in Estonia this summer, and you said that there is no chance that...
There is what?
So you mentioned...
I just can't hear you.
So you mentioned that...
The Baltic states.
Yeah, the Baltic states, and you mentioned that there is no chance because they're in NATO. But actually, I was in Estonia this summer, and there's 25% of Russians in Estonia that are, which is not a minority, I would say, considerable. And my question is, do you think that being in NATO secures you to not being invaded and repeating the same situation that happened in Crimea? Because as Estonians are seeing it, they're very afraid of this happening because the minority is so separated from the nation and from other Estonians. So the Russian kind of minority is growing and it's getting their independence kind of. So do you think that being in NATO still secures you these rights? And do you think that being in organizations like that kind of secures you the safety?
I think you could probably, answer that better. But I mean, I could just start by saying, I mean, if you're suggesting that Russia is going to then bolster this Russian minority in Estonia, that's what you're suggesting, right? And maybe they would do that, but that's not invading a country and getting involved in a war there. So yeah, no, I think it does protect you. I don't know what you think.
I mean, I guess I would agree with that, and at the same time, there's always the potential for mistakes to be made. There's also the potential for decisions that were not made centrally to be carried out locally, and for there to be cross-border clashes. I mean, what I would hope in that situation would be that, cooler heads would prevail, and that the powers, that NATO would step in and have some kind of a negotiation, and that it would be resolved, right, without an invading force, in the Baltics. But I could easily understand why the people in the Baltic states would be very, very anxious about having Russia next door, and feel rather unconfident in the promise of support from NATO. As Oleg was saying about the guarantee of safety to Ukraine, that didn't exactly pan out, right? So I could totally see the anxiety, and would just sort of hope that that if there was to be a conflict, that there would be a negotiated way out of it before it got out of control.
I just don't see what Russia would get out of it. Yeah. So I don't think Russia has the same investment in and feelings about Estonia as it does about Ukraine.
About Crimea,
a special Crimea and Ukraine more generally, which is just a special case.
Yeah, just historically, I think you're.
Excuse me?
Putin's ratings.
Yeah, right.
So the internal political situation, of course, is extremely important, right? In any of those.
Yeah,
but I think even in terms of the political ratings, though, I mean, you couldn't get the same kind of domestic boost from invading a Baltic country that you could get from Crimea, right? Because there's so much popular support for the idea. They all went. They all went and vacationed in Crimea. There's so many family ties, across the border. I don't think that it's quite the same. I don't think it's quite the same with the Baltics. But I guess we'll see.
Okay, Professor Sperling, Professor Tumarkin, thank you for guiding us through these complexities. Please join me in thanking our panelists.